and welcome to Widdecombe, Webb and Woberts. My name is Emma Webb, and as usual I am joined by former Shadow Home Secretary and Brexit Party MEP Anne Widdecombe, and Abby Woberts, the comedian, who is back from her sojourn in an illness that was not COVID. one of the rare.
Hello.
So this week we're obviously starting on a sombre note because of the killing of Conservative MP David Amess, and I think we'll probably just dive straight into that without much introduction. I'm sure everybody has seen the news coverage over the last couple of days, so if we wanted to start, I think just with Anne, because Anne knew him personally.
Indeed, he was a very close personal friend. I've known him for years and years, ever since I entered Parliament in 1987. I was a close friend of the family, godmother to one of the children, so it's much more than just an MP to me. It's a very close friend. And it is indeed horrendous. I mean, the thing about David was he was always so full of enthusiasm. He used to bubble away about Southend all the time, trying to get its city status. And he was terribly enthusiastic about Parliament and its traditions. And even in the age of the all-night sittings, he would be among the last to leave. He just wanted to be there, wanted to be involved. And I think of him going to his constituency surgery that terrible morning, going in his usual way, all full of enthusiasm, wondering who he was going to meet, wondering what problems would be, looking forward to getting stuck in, and then that.
And do you feel that, there were a lot of eulogies in Parliament and the silence that was held? Do you have any reflections on that? Any particular sort of feelings about some of the speeches that some MPs have given?
Well, the speeches were wonderful, and I'm sure David would have absolutely loved them. The flags were at half-mast. Both houses of Parliament suspended all normal business to pay tributes. And it was indeed about a remarkable man. So I think it was a very moving occasion. I know that his wife Julia was very, very touched by it.
And a lot of the in the first couple of hours, I guess it would have been, there were some interviews by the press of constituents. I assume they were constituents, local people who knew him. And one of the things that I noticed was that through and through almost every single interview, the word approachable kept coming up. And as someone who has never met him, Leigh-on-Sea is actually very close to where I'm from. So for me, it's almost a neighbouring constituency. I was very much aware of the fact that since I was 4 years old, he'd been the MP of it's almost like his furniture in Essex. And as I say, the word approachable kept coming up, and it just sounded to me like he was the epitome of the constituency MP, someone who was just absolutely part of his people. People have been saying that it didn't matter whether you voted for him or not, he would represent everyone in his constituency, whether it was, helping refugees, whether it was stuff to do with animal rights and things like that. There were so many causes that were dear to his heart, but he was really representing his constituency in that traditional old-fashioned sort of way.
I think when you use the word approachable, you're implying that people could approach him. But in fact, he used to approach everybody else. I mean, I always say when talking about David that, there's no such thing as a waiter who comes to take his order, who can then take the order before David has spent 10 minutes getting all his personal history out of him. And trying to get him away from an event, was almost impossible, because he always wanted to talk to people at huge length. And so he wasn't just approachable, he was approaching as well.
The Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, as well said that that he would come into their office just to talk to the staff, and that when someone left after 28 years, he showered him with presents. And someone else was saying that when he would see him travelling late night back to the constituency from London on the train, and that he was never somebody who just sit there and read his book. He would be talking to everyone on the train.
Yeah, that is very much David. My own ex-staff, who were all writing to me at the time when it happened, were all recalling when he would come into their office, never mind his own office. He would come into their office and always had a joke and a funny story. And they were all recalling that, and that was the essential David Amess.
And what were your, if you don't mind me asking, what were your first thoughts when you heard the news?
Disbelief, just total disbelief. I'm still in denial to a certain extent, and it's very, very difficult to believe. I was away at the time. I was on a train when I heard from his wife, who said it's not looking good, and then not very long after that, minutes rather than hours, she was the widow who said to me, he's gone, or he's died. I still can't believe it. I came home from that weekend away and opened my front door, and there was his face looking up at me from every single newspaper that was on the doormat. And you can't say how you feel. I mean, everybody I've spoken to who knows him well, everybody is saying we just can't believe it's happened. Why? You know, the sort of the endless question, why? Why would anybody want to do that?
And can I ask you also if you remember the first time that you met him? If you have any recollections of your sort of first impressions of him?
Well, I actually met him, first of all, in a very serious context, because we were both involved in the big pro-life campaigns of the late 80s and the early 90s, when there were a number of bills going through Parliament. And we were very heavily engaged in it, and that's when I got to know him. And he was a tremendous practical joker. You know, I can remember one day we'd both gone up to the constituency of Ken Hargreaves, which was in Lancashire. And we were sitting there in Ken's lounge, and Ken went out to do something. The phone went, and David picked it up. And there was a constituent on the other end, and David just pretended to be Ken Hargreaves. Started advising the constituent.
I think I'm probably, you know, one of many people I've seen on Twitter saying they wish that they'd met him. Because, like I say, I was aware that he was a piece of furniture in Essex in a neighbouring constituency,
so, yeah.
But I actually never had the pleasure to meet him, and I know that he knew Andrew Rosendale, who is very much our neighbouring constituency MP, and they obviously have in common their total love of animals. And one of the first things that I did, you know, within a couple of hours afterwards, I ended up sort of scrolling through all of these photos on Google Images, and probably more than 50% of his photos available online are him with animals.
He's one of the very few backbenchers who's actually got a bill onto the statute book, and it was about tethering of ponies and donkeys, and because he was photographed outside Parliament on a horse. David, as far as I know, has never ridden in his life, but he was there on this horse outside Parliament. And he inherited my office. Well, that is to say, he and I conspired to make sure that he did, because it was a nice big office, because when I got it, I was Shadow Home Secretary, and he was determined he was going to have this when I left. And we agreed that possession was 9/10 of the law, so if he just moved everything in before I'd moved everything out, it was fine. You know, nobody was going to argue about it. And I went back in to see it after the election. He was indeed there. And it was, I mean, with me, it had been an office, you know, there was a conference table and there were filing cabinets, and it was an office. And I went in, and it was a botanical gardens, and we had fish tanks, and we had birds in cages, and these enormous plants, and memorabilia all over the walls, and didn't look like an MP's office at all.
He sounds like such a character. And also when he was knighted, there was that brilliant photo, and actually I can't remember which newspaper it was, I think it was the Daily Mail, did a huge spread of him on horseback dressed as a knight.
I saw that. Yeah, in a wood. Yes.
And was another photo of him as well outside of Parliament holding two very uppity looking horses, which I assume must have been something to do with that tethering act. But yeah, so I moving on slightly to the reaction to it. Do you have any reflections on, you know, the fact that I mean, the conversation has obviously very quickly turned to the safety of MPs and whether there should be extra restrictions for close constituency surgeries, because obviously Jo Cox was also murdered, I think it was outside of her constituency surgery, and there have been other instances as well of attacks at surgeries as well. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's going to affect democracy if they go ahead with that? When you were an MP, did you feel that, you know, your safety was at risk? Do you think that?
No, I didn't. I once, when I was very first an MP indeed, made some very disobliging comments about the IRA. and death threats came in purporting to be from the IRA, and I just said to my staff, if the IRA were going to do anything, they'd just do it. They wouldn't bother threatening. Forget it.
Don't worry, they'll call
first. Put it in the waste paper basket.
Yeah.
And I think you do have to keep a sense of proportion. And the one thing David would not want, David of all people would not want, is for MPs to be separated for their constituents. For us to do constituency surgeries with police outside the door with screens. It's crucial that MPs can mingle perfectly freely with their constituents in surgery, visiting constituents in their own homes, which we all used to do a lot. Meeting constituents on the streets, going to events, going to public fetes and all the rest of it. And if you can't do that, then that really will be a massive disservice to democracy. And David would not want those sorts of restrictions imposed in his name. He would not want it.
And what do you think of both of you? Firstly, what he would have thought, but also what your views are on this suggestion that there should be background checks on constituents going to see their MPs to see if they've got a criminal record.
God forbid. God forbid, quite honestly. And a constituent coming to see an MP is like a patient going to see a doctor. You don't go in, if they've come with a problem that they're expecting you to address. And if you start saying you're going to do criminal record checks, they won't come. If they've got anything in the past, they won't come. And that is quite wrong. That is a denial of a vital service. And I would simply refuse. If I were an MP, I would refuse to give any such list.
Those with criminal records are still eligible to vote. So it seems like an absurd suggestion.
And they're
to
eligible for help. Would you prevent them going to hospital? If not, why prevent them coming to see the MP? Would you prevent them going to see a solicitor or prevent them going to see an accountant or any other professional? Why shouldn't they see an MP? That is ridiculous. And David would have said it is ridiculous.
Yeah, we don't want this, what's happened, to allow people, shall we say, with authoritarian intent to use incidents like this to let things slip in through the back door, because it's very easy, isn't it, to say, well, let's just it's what happened after 9/11, where CCTV cameras were put everywhere and all of a sudden we become a surveillance state. We don't want that. I agree with Anne that if we start going down that path, then it really is going to be sort of Houses of Commons and then the people, and they'll get wider and wider and wider gap.
In my time in Parliament, we had an incident in which Fathers for Justice, which, by the way, is an organisation I support, but I didn't support this particular action.
In the supermarket, they used to go up the...
That's right.
Yeah,
they shouldn't have Buckingham Palace, but they were in the public gallery in the House of Commons and they threw talcum powder at the Prime Minister. Now, it was only talcum powder. But, of course, everybody said, it could have been anthrax. So they set a screen up between the public gallery and the chamber, and that was the first time that had happened. We'd gone through all the IRA, we'd gone through all the terrorism, we'd gone through everything, and suddenly there it was because somebody had thrown some talcum powder at the Prime Minister. And that, in my view, at the time was a gross overreaction. I used to look up and see a screen instead of... And it is not what I wanted to see.
Do you think that the response, obviously there's a lot we can talk about in relation to the way that people have responded to this, particularly the focus on social media rather than talking about extremism and the potential motivations of the attacker. But do you think that the response has been proportionate, or the suggestions about David's law, which some people are suggesting, and Priti Patel talking about regulating online speech more, and
don't worry, Priti Patel says she's going to do something, it won't happen. So
exactly.
That's immensely reassuring if you're saying that.
Do you think that the focus on needing to regulate what they think is a sort of toxic atmosphere within Parliament, attacks on Angela Rayner for her comments about Tory scum, do you think that is just is that an inappropriate reaction to it? What do you think he would have thought of that reaction?
David hated those sorts of campaigns on social media, but the fact is they've been with us forever, or ever since social media came into being. And they are unpleasant and they are quite wrong, and occasionally I think they should actually be taken down and be censored, and I do think that. But I think the idea that you can somehow legislate for people's behaviour and for their attitudes is naive. You can't regulate people's behaviour. And there was a time when people would have been saying this sort of thing, but they would have been saying it in the corners of pubs to their mates, and nobody else would know about it. Now they fire it across social media.
And we're conflating speech with action, which is happening a lot in other areas.
Well, this is life. I find it interesting that there wasn't any discussion really around, other than on certain channels like Talk Radio or on GB News, where they did talk about Islamist extremism. They were talking about the fact that it wasn't being discussed more broadly, that the focus had immediately turned onto social media, and that Dominic Raab, just as one example, when he was doing the media rounds, I think it was yesterday morning, this is a quote from him, he sort of pinned it on the, as he put it, widespread vilification of politicians, said that online hate is out of control and that it is incumbent on all of us as a society because this creates a climate of hatred. And so it seemed that, and as I say, this idea of David's law, which is it seems is being suggested as something that would be limiting the expression of hate online. It seems that even though all of the information that we have so far about what has happened is, all we know from the police is that there is a man who has been arrested, he's being detained under the Terrorism Act, he hasn't been charged yet, and the police have stated that they're investigating an Islamist extremist motive. That's all we have. We don't have anything to do with radicalisation, all of this talk about Priti Patel wanting to ban anonymity online, all of that kind of thing. Do you think that's disproportionate? Do you think how do you make sense of that reaction?
I'd be quite in favour of banning anonymity online, because I've always taken the view that if you've got something to say it. You know, and if you have to hide when you're saying it, then there is something radically wrong. So actually, I don't have a problem with that. I know that probably, you know, goes against very much the grain with you, but I have always felt if you've got something to say, put your name to it. Then, if somebody wants to take any action about it, they can do so. My one fear slightly is with people with whistleblowers that need to. Need to sort of remain anonymous. So where does it go? You know, if you sort of always have to say this is who I am, then it's going to make it very difficult.
The reason why I think anonymity is important for free speech in general is because you mentioned whistleblowers, but also pro-democracy dissidents, people who are seeking anonymous advice online, which I think people are entirely entitled to do. After somebody, but also, and this was a point that I believe it was made by Matt Lesh, I think was at the ASI and is now at the IEA, on Twitter, which is that it's not just pro-democracy dissidents in places like Hong Kong or Belarus. It's also people here, gender-critical feminists, who might like to express their views but don't want to be seen because they fear that for their job, even though they should be allowed to say those things, they can only say them anonymously, or because they have a particular job and therefore they are not able to participate openly in online discussions.
A job in TV. They won't be able to say that.
And add all those categories up, Emma. And what sort of proportion do you think it is of social media as a whole? I mean, the fact is, you know, anonymity in those sorts of cases is one thing, but that is not what anonymity is usually used for. And it's used to spread hatred and you know. And I take the line very firmly that if you say something, you are responsible for what you say. And you should be traceable.
There was actually a study done on this that found that it was actually the non-anonymous accounts that were more aggressive online than the anonymous ones. So actually, I think a lot of the time anonymous accounts are just people who are almost voyeurs on social media. They're there because they're keeping up with the news and so on, and they want to participate in discussions, but don't necessarily want to be seen and so on. But it's not because they're spreading hate. Another example of this is, and she's no longer on Twitter actually, a grooming gang survivor who had her Twitter account taken away from her for whatever reason. I think probably she was Twitter mobbed and people were reporting her account. But there are people like grooming gang survivors on there who may wish to remain anonymous because for various reasons. One of the reasons...
I say again, you are picking on the very extreme cases. You are not looking at the use of social media as a whole, which has... social media can be a tremendous force for good. But it is all too often the exact opposite.
But is that a price worth paying in order to allow those people to have a voice?
That does not mean that you have to put Mary Smith of 3 railway cuttings on your email. What it means is that if you do something that is wrong or say something that is wrong and somebody wishes redress, that that person can find out who Mary Smith of 3 Railway Cuttings is.
And if Mary Smith from 3 Railway Cuttings is listening in, we're really sorry we've just given you away. But I was just going to say, but isn't it? I hear both arguments, but isn't it to do with the principle, like Emma was saying, that it's the principle of it, a bit like when people say, if I've got nothing to hide, why shouldn't there be surveillance on me? It's that which is that's not the point. Is that it's not the fact you haven't got anything to hide. It's the fact that there's people watching you when
something else that has been pointed out. I believe it was in an article in Spiked. Is how do you, if you do have it so that people can be publicly anonymous, but privately the companies, they're verified, the companies know who they are. Yeah. Either you need some kind of, if it comes from the government, you need some kind of ID. I don't really know how that would work, but the more likely suggestion would be that the companies themselves would hold that information. But companies like Facebook have had numerous breaches of that information. And if you took a case of somebody who wants to be online, but for maybe child protection reasons, or maybe they've been a victim of abuse or something, or a grooming gang survivor. And as I know of this particular case of this lady who was thrown off, she didn't want to give them anything to verify her account because she doesn't give. I knew her and she wouldn't even tell me what her name was.
She's pretty terrified of
exactly. And so
the gangs.
Even if it was the case that you would be publicly anonymous, do you want these big tech companies to have that information? I
do want that information available, not publicly available, but accessible. And all I would say is, yes, there can be breaches of confidentiality. There have been. The banks have lost, people's documents. And the health service has. And there are always scandals about, breaches of confidentiality. And that is something that needs addressing in its own right. But I don't think you can say that just because it is a big company, therefore, there's bound to be a breach, and that's dangerous. Breaches are always dangerous, but they can occur anywhere. They don't just have to occur on social media. So all I'm saying is, I'm quite happy for people to be publicly anonymous, providing that the companies know who they are, and under certain very restricted conditions, and you can lay down all the checks that you want for restricted conditions. It should be possible to find out who somebody is.
And of course, the reality is, big tech probably knows who you are anyway. She says, throwing in a sinister note.
Yeah. The big old elephant in the room, because we've actually done what the press have done, which is we've been talking about the social media side of things. My question, and this is something that perplexes me, is how on earth we got from what happened almost immediately to talking about social media, even though
that's where hate spreads.
But
because that's where hate spreads. That's why that is the stepping stone.
Do you think it's wrong that we haven't, within the mainstream media, there hasn't been a lot of conversation around the one thing that we do know from the police, which is that they're investigating an Islamist extremist motive?
And I'll tell you exactly why there hasn't been that conversation. The law is very strict in this country about prejudicing trials. The fact that the police are looking into something does not mean that it is established as fact. And until it is, you could actually end up with some very clever defence barrister saying, my defendant cannot get a fair trial. It's quite impossible. So therefore, if the police are looking at something, frankly, the most responsible thing the rest of us can do is to note that and then shut up.
But we also don't know that the reason why, if it is an Islamist attack, then it's very unlikely that, for example, people have blamed the toxicity within parliamentary. I don't think he was sitting there watching BBC Parliament. I think it's very unlikely that he has been, or that he was, maybe he was at the Labour Party conference, I don't know, but if it is an Islamist motive, then the conversation around the online atmosphere is going to have very little bearing on the motivation.
May have very little bearing on this particular case, but it has a lot of bearing on society in general and the way that we're operating and the way that hate is spreading. You can have that conversation. I think it's a perfectly reasonable conversation to have.
But what's interesting, in the IRA's time, there was no social media, but the hate for this country was as we all know. I mean, I was actually just left Harrods when the Harrods bomb went off. I'd left with my mother. I mean, literally half an hour before.
I missed the Brighton bomb by 20 minutes.
Really?
Yeah.
So it was all very there. It was there. We knew about it because if people, I mean, sorry, this sounds a bit sort of a bit of a cliche, but to me, hatred starts in there, and if that, we need a wider conversation, I think, about. Well, I mean, we'll probably get onto this, but about the fact this is a Judeo-Christian country and we're tolerant of faiths, but we have to establish the Judeo-Christian bit first. Otherwise, what's going to happen is everyone's going to try and assert their dominance in this country, and God bless Sir David, he is another victim of it.
While we're on the subject of Christianity, I gather that he was denied the last rites.
Yeah,
he was.
I can't believe it.
I cried when I heard that.
I can't believe it.
So I wanted, I actually wanted to read out
How can the police be so ignorant?
I wanted to read out the police statement for you to respond to, because it's a long one. So bear with me. I'll just read it out in full. The police said, as with any police incident, it is of the utmost importance that we preserve the integrity of a crime scene and allow emergency services to tend to those in need. A cordon is put in place to secure and prevent contamination of the area. Access to a scene is at the discretion of the investigating officers. This is a fundamental part of any investigation to ensure the best possible chance of securing justice for any victim and their family. A cordon can also be used to restrict an area for emergency services to administer potentially life-saving medical treatment in as much privacy as possible and to allow officers to confirm an area is safe to enter. Do you think that giving the last rites should be regarded as an emergency service?
I was going to say, dear Chief Constable, if you are a dying Catholic, the priest is an emergency service. Dear Chief Constable, of course it's very important to save lives, but do you not understand that if you're a Catholic, the saving of your immortal soul is also really rather important? And dear Chief Constable, if I should ever be so unfortunate to be in need of the last rites inside a close-off zone, will you please make sure that I get them?
Here. Chief Constable of 3 cuttings.
I hope you're listening, Chief Constable.
Yeah, exactly.
You've been told.
You're listening. I was honestly, when I read that, I
couldn't believe it. The denial of the last rites.
I cried because I thought that is. It sort of went to the kernel, I think, of what's wrong with this country is that we sort of. It's computer says no. Yeah, sorry,
the
we're
rule
not able
book
to.
Says,
exactly,
the
rule book says not. Where's the humanity? Where's the respect for this man?
They wouldn't have understood it. They wouldn't have understood what they are.
I was.
Do you think it was a case that they actually just simply did not know what the last rites were?
I think they had no clue what.
And thought, why is this priest trying to get into the
cordon? They probably thought, what's that? Coming to. I mean, it's horrendous.
It is absolutely horrendous.
Yeah, there's a lot around this about culture and everything.
I think
mixed in.
we should definitely return to it, but I'm going to ask you this just because I think that probably those watching will want me to ask you this. Don't you think that, and this is, I've seen this, various commentators have been talking about this over the last day or so, which is this question of, it may be the case that there is a discussion to be had about the social media stuff and the way that MPs, I actually think that MPs should hold themselves to a higher professional standard than they do in the way they sling mud at each other. I think many of them, like Angela Rayner, don't act very professionally. But that is a separate conversation to be had. And yes, I do take your point about prejudicing trials, but do you think that actually the reason why the conversation has immediately turned to this is because it's something that feels like it's more within our control, whereas the Islamist extremist problem is something that keeps coming back. We've struggled to deal with it, always talking about online radicalization and things like that seem easier to solve than the real life problem. Do you think that is the reason why we've almost skipped the Groundhog Day part that we usually, the formulas that we normally recite in response to attacks? And because if in a case like Joe Cox, we quite rightly were all talking about far right extremism in relation to it. It was one of the first things that people were discussing. So my question would be, and I think this is probably what those watching would want to know what your views are on this. Do you think that these are two separate conversations, that the question is, how did we get from one to the other so quickly? Why did that happen?
I think there were a lot of conversations. I mean, if you actually look at the headlines, you know, the fact that a suspect had been referred to the Prevent programme at one point, you know, all this was rehearsed. I don't think it was ignored, it was all rehearsed. But then it got on to hatred in general. And you can't ignore the fact that MPs in Parliament were talking about hatred in social media. So, I mean, I think the conversation just did move on, but I say again, be very, very careful about prejudicing trials.
But is the reason why it did move on in that way because MPs with the online safety bill and all of these other conversations that are happening at the moment, they were already thinking about this, they were already talking about it, and so it sort of became part of this bigger abstract. And I think that often in response to terror attacks, we're in danger of always very quickly jumping into the very, very large area of things that are tangentially related to the problem and never looking at the problem in the face.
We're terrified. I have no idea why. We're more afraid of offending people than we are of people being murdered in cold blood. That's where we are.
There has, and Talk Radio, absolutely credit to Talk Radio, have had lots of discussions about Islamism.
Yes.
And some people are saying we shouldn't be calling it Islamist terrorism. That is it's discriminatory, or it stirs up hatred against the Muslim community. But my argument would be Islamism is a distinct thing. It is an intellectual tradition and it is Islamist terrorism. That is the phenomenon. But I find it interesting that so quickly, and you know, it's the classic deflection, you know, that whenever something happens, we always end up talking about something that is
something else.
Exactly, so quickly. And I wonder whether that is because we genuinely do not know how to deal with the problem.
I think the fear is that if you start talking about Islamist terrorism, you're going to be branding all Muslims in a particular way. Now, in case you think that's silly, just reflect how the British public behaves. In the First World War, it used to kick Dachshunds across the street because they were just...
That's not true, surely.
It is absolutely true. In the Second World War...
Were Dachshunds terrorists at that time? Were they sort of
They were German. They were German.
That's true.
That's what it was about, the First World War. You don't remember? No, of course you don't. But
I'm not quite that old.
Do you recall your history? And in the Second World War, Italian restaurants were burnt down. The British public can behave badly, and I think there's always that fear there that once you start talking about Islam, you're somehow, I mean, I know you're not, but the fear is that you are somehow branding all Muslims. That's the fear.
But don't we have to, if your argument is that Islam is one thing and Islamism is another thing, isn't it important to be able to name Islamism as being the motivation, to actually be able to describe the thing that you're talking about?
I'm not saying you shouldn't, I'm trying to explain to you what I think the fear is.
The fear is.
There's a question here from Robin Forsyth. He asks about Salman Abedi and how Salman Abedi's older brother, the Manchester Arena bomber, has left the UK. He said, when are authorities going to get a grip on what we've been discussing? Why haven't they done so already?
Well, I don't know why they haven't done so already. I suspect the will isn't there.
Yeah.
The will isn't there.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like those grooming gangs with those girls.
Yeah.
And they didn't do anything because they were afraid that in the course of protecting women they were going to cause racial offence.
Yes.
And so the will is not there. The will to actually get to grips with something is not there.
You're right. The will, and also the pride in being British, which includes tolerance, but must also include recognising our cultural history. Because if we don't, sorry, I keep repeating Douglas Murray saying, we are going to end up sort of, in a very dangerous place.
So we shall return to the subject of Christianity in a bit, but first I want to talk about, again, on the topic of online censorship and so on. David Davis this really goes to the heart of how much do you trust social media companies to decide what is and is not allowed to be said on their platforms. David Davis, the MP, he did a talk at Conservative Party conference with, very ironically, given what happened, Big Brother Watch, the organisation, and I'm sure everyone can figure out from the name what Big Brother Watch is all about, keeping an eye on Big Brother. And Big Brother, then in this case Google, which owns YouTube, removed his very well evidenced, very fair and measured speech, the video, took it down from YouTube. And he's written a very interesting piece in the Express talking about how, so he says here, he says, I have been a strong advocate for vaccines and science-based policy, but a core premise of science is challenging conventional wisdom and being unafraid to speak your mind. Difference of opinion arbitrated by the facts, not powerful platform providers on the other side of the world. And he goes on to say that it showed in the clearest terms why big tech cannot be trusted to police our speech. And he also talks as well about how, and I think this is very interesting as well, is that the policy that YouTube use in taking these things down, they actually took down Talk Radio at a while ago for what they had been putting out on pandemic related things, I think probably anti-mask, anti-lockdown. And he said that their policy is basically to remove things that contradict local health authorities or the World Health Organization. So he said, in debating a key aspect of national health policy, I cannot disagree with the government, ? You could be forgiven for thinking we had suddenly been transported to China. Yeah, so what do you think of this?
I think those are very reasonable observations from David Davis. The fact is that is censorship not on the basis of harm being done or crimes being committed, but simply on the basis that somebody is confronting and challenging state orthodoxy. And the very definition of freedom is that you can challenge state orthodoxy. And the very definition of fascism is that you can't.
Yeah, agreed. And something very strange has happened. Science has become, one-sided, has become a sort of...
it's not challengeable.
Exactly. It's bizarre.
Science is a discussion. That's
exactly
the nature of it.
Exactly, a discussion. It's weird. Everything is the nature of things has been changed quite drastically over the last 18 or so months. So science has changed, but also what's happening with David Davis is discussing vaccine passports. I mean, it's most peculiar.
I'm aware that we're getting short on time, so there are two more things that I want to ask you about quickly before we close. The first is, as I said, we would return to the subject of Christianity, the conversion of the Anglican Bishop Nazir Ali to Catholicism. What are your thoughts?
Hugely significant, this one, because unlike recent trends, because the Church of England has lost bishops to Rome now for some years, but unlike the usual pattern, he was not an Anglo-Catholic. That is, he was not already in sympathy with Catholic
who recently converted too.
He wasn't an Anglo-Catholic. He was in fact much nearer to the evangelical wing, so he really has done an enormous jump. Now that is very significant, because once that starts to happen, once members of the Church of England start to say, look, this is just so bad that we do want something where a church knows what it's teaching, teaches it unapologetically, doesn't care whether it's popular or not, doesn't care whether it's modish and fashionable or not, doesn't care whether it's woke or not, but just goes for truth. Once they start saying that, then I think you are looking, as I say in my excellent column in the Daily Express tomorrow, I think you're looking at the eventual, not the immediate, but the eventual death knell of the Church of England.
Yeah. Well, I am one of those Anglo-Catholics looking to Rome. So I obviously have my own views on what I think is wrong with the Anglican Church, but do you have a sort of diagnosis of why the Church of England has... and actually, in the context of this, they are discussing at the moment, there's a brilliant Twitter account which you should all follow called Friendless Churches, and they put up their brilliant charity, and they put out a tweet basically bringing to everyone's attention the fact that the church is looking to change its rules to make it easier to sell off church buildings. So what is your diagnosis of what is wrong with the Church of England?
I don't know.
It doesn't know what it thinks.
I don't know. I'm not as clued up as Anne and Emma are, but I assume is it like going from Man U to Chelsea? Is that bigger?
That's what he's done.
Terrible. Sorry to lower the theological tone.
Can count on you, Abby.
Somewhat. Yeah. Sorry, guys. Going for the populist vote. But yes. Well, I mean, I don't. Part of me sort of thinks I don't really blame him. But then the other part of me thinks, is it better to stay on a better to stay on board?
Ship.
No, not
on a sinking ship.
I mean, to sort of to stay and sort of like put your mast in the sand and say, I'm going to defend the Church of England. I mean,
He's been doing that for years. He's been doing that for years.
So what you're saying is it's gone so woke.
He's reached a point he can't do it that way any longer.
He's seen too many rainbows and sort of unicorn.
That's what strikes me as so interesting, is that both Nazir Ali and Gavin Ashenden, who used to be I believe he was the chaplain to the Queen, also recently converted from Anglicanism to Catholicism, is that both of them are individuals who were the ones that would fight for the Church of England to stay sound, essentially. And so if they are the ones who are jumping ship to Catholicism, that suggests to me that those who are most savvy about theology and the foundations of the Church of England have decided, and as you say, because he's from the evangelical side rather than the Anglo-Catholic, suggests that this is really like the sign of the changing of the seasons, that the Church of England it's not a sinking ship, it's sunk.
No, I think it's still sinking, and I think it's going to sink terribly, terribly slowly. I don't think it's going to happen
one bishop at a time
by Tuesday afternoon. One bishop at a time. But I think, you asked for the reason. The reason is simple enough. It doesn't know what it believes. You can get as many different opinions in the Church of England, as there are in the world.
You don't get bums on seats by putt-putt courses and helter-skelters and lovely gift shops.
Yes.
They haven't actually, increased their congregations by adopting a woke policy. They haven't increased their congregations at all.
Well, actually, if you listen, I am in the habit of listening to strange, obscure clerical lectures and things that some of the more curious elements of the Church of England put up on YouTube, and it's obvious. It just seems obvious to me that they are, I suppose you would say, theologically inept. There's just no meat. It's no basis to it. It's just air.
A metaphor for the country.
Quite.
I mean, Church of England is what's happening to us.
They are the canary in the coal mine, the
Yeah.
cultural canary in the coal mine. So I just briefly want to finish with final thoughts on a slightly lighter story. Right. Perhaps it's not a lighter story, I don't know. Crazy story is the National Church of Scotland has banned the word spooky.
Hey?
Sorry, the National Theatre of Scotland. Did I say church?
We're obsessed
No,
with the church today.
the National Theatre of Scotland has banned the word spooky because they say it's a racial slur. And they say it's a racial slur because apparently in World War II, US military officers used it to refer to black pilots. And also, in the same story, the National Library of Scotland, also not the National Church of Scotland, is apparently amending the words plantation and slave in its collections, in their indexes and catalogues, and they've changed the word slave to enslaved person, which just seems like it's more words for the same thing.
Exactly.
And the word plantation to forced labour plantation.
Oh,
grief.
I hardly feel like commenting. I mean, the stupidity is just mind-boggling. And as for spook, I don't know the etymology of spook.
It comes from the word. It comes from spook in Dutch.
But it has been around. Has been around for a very long time.
Yeah.
And apparently, spook in Dutch simply means ghost.
Spook, like spies.
Which that's actually where the word spook comes from, the Dutch.
Yeah. So it's like, and as you rightly said earlier on, is how you're going to describe spies.
Yeah.
If you don't use the word, spook. And also
we always talk about spooks when we're talking about the intelligence services.
If you want to see a country that we don't want to become, look at Scotland. I mean, they really are the canary in the coal mine. I don't want to be like them.
You'll be up for racism now.
I will. Oh no!
What a wonderful note to end on.
I've been cancelled.
Yeah, you'll be cancelled all throughout Scotland.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, Scotland.
Sorry.
Thank you for
Sorry.
joining us again. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Abby. Please like if you feel so inclined, comment, and we will see you next time.